Hello, and welcome to the Rejuvenation Roundup podcast, where we explore the latest in life extension and anti-aging science with a dive into a month's worth of insights and new breakthroughs. This podcast is a combined effort of the Lifespan Extension Advocacy Foundation, which operates Lifespan.io, and Future Grind, a podcast that explores the ethics and impact of emerging science and technology. I'm Ryan O'Shea, and I'll be your host. Spooky season is now behind us, and we are already approaching the end of 2021. Time is flying, which increases the urgency with which we should collectively seek to tackle the problem of aging. Let's catch up on the updates from October. Kicking things off with our research roundup, researchers have proven that our bodies partially compensate for calories burned during exercise by cutting energy expenditure on vital functions. Their discovery might explain why it can be so hard to lose weight by working out. However, this discovery will also allow scientists, doctors, and fitness trainers to account for energy compensation and to build programs that better manage expectations while causing less confusion and frustration. Researchers publishing in Frontiers in Aging Neuroscience have discovered that blood pressure is directly linked to brain aging. For this analysis, the researchers chose brain age, a well-known machine learning-based biomarker that uses MRI imagery in order to determine age. They found that every 10 extra millimeters of mercury over a mean blood pressure of 90 was shown to be linked to over 2 additional months of brain aging. Therefore, an individual with a pre-hypertensive blood pressure of 135/85, for example, was most likely to have a brain 6 months older than that of someone with an optimal blood pressure of 110/70. This was applicable over the whole range and was not caused by extreme cases. Scientists publishing in the journal Nature Aging showed that hair loss happens partially as a result of stem cells escaping from hair follicles. It is extremely hard to monitor stem cell activity in live animals over time, yet this is exactly what the researchers have achieved using non-invasive imaging techniques based on lasers. By putting mice inside of the imaging device, they were able to observe and record the process of stem cells escaping their compartment adjacent to the hair follicle. This escape likely constitutes a previously unknown mechanism of hair aging, and these findings seem to support the idea that the integrity of the extracellular matrix might be a much more crucial factor of aging than previously thought. This work not only reveals a potentially reversible mechanism of hair loss, it also pioneers a non-invasive imaging technology that enables the observation of aging on the cellular level in live animals. A study published in the Nature journal Aging and Mechanisms of Disease has shown that supplementation with nicotinamide riboside, or NR, substantially improves the immune systems of older mice due to its effects on stem cell fate. Unfortunately, nearly all of the gains that were experienced by these aged mice were reverted once the supplement was removed from their diet, often leaving them worse than when they started. Neutrophils and inflammation, which were reduced during NR supplementation, were worse after its removal than in untreated wild-type mice. Therefore, the researchers hold that if NR is to be used to combat immune aging, it needs to be taken over the long term. That's it for our research roundup. For more information on these or many other stories, you can visit lifespan.io/roundup. Some more videos from our Ending Age-Related Diseases conference have been released, including one in which Elena Milova interviews Foresight Institute Executive Director Allison Duettmann about existential hope and the need for longevity on both an individual and civilizational scale. Here's a bit of what she had to say.
People often tend to look at their life as a narrative arc of one story with some kind of inflection point, and then it kind of tapers off and goes to a happy ending, or hopefully happy ending. But and this also doesn't come from me, but if you think more of your life as like a book with many short stories, right, there would be so many different different types of chapters that you would want to have even within the short story, and then the whole life as a whole could entail many more of those short stories. And I think that, sticking with the metaphor of books for a second, I think to me it really just occurred to how much is available. When I remember as a child, there was a time when I made a list of all of the books I really wanted to read. And I thought that I could probably just go through them in a few years. And then obviously, as you start reading, more books come on the list. And meanwhile, also more books get written. And so that's the first time when it occurred to me that it's really unlikely that one lifetime will be enough for the books I want to read. And then obviously that moment that you realize that, you also realize that there's not only books to read, but there's many, 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 many other things to do. And very likely over the course, also other things, even like other categories of things, even invented, that you could then also become great at. And so it just seems like that 80 or 90 years is an arbitrary number for wanting to go through all of this. And I'm not saying that, it cannot ever be exhausted. Maybe it will be, but it's just that I think that with the current limits, it's unlikely that by that time, we will get through the things that we would like to do ideally. And I think the same applies for civilization at large as well, right? If you look on a civilizational timeline, we have really just only become intelligent. We have barely, the wits to, as a civilization, even remain alive. And so I think just we're peeking around the corner. Many folks are gearing up for space, at least exploration at the moment, right? Like, I mean, after the 50-year lag, somehow now it's happening again. And so I think it would be really a shame if on a civilizational level, we stop now. And I think that, again, not everyone has to want this at all, but we're just getting started on a civilization level, right? Like brain-computer interfaces, I know that they still sound sci-fi, but people are working on them. Space exploration, people are working on them. There is so much potential available, and we have only discovered even that there is potential on a civilizational scale, that I think it would be really premature if we destroy ourselves now, either individually or really as a civilization at large. So I think when starting to think that it could be possible for humans to live longer, I think the second thought that everyone has immediately is, well, that doesn't really work if civilization won't be around, right? And so I think that an interesting thing here is that you immediately have a larger outlook on life. And first I thought, well, maybe my wish for living longer is just a puberty version almost of a larger version of a life as a thing in itself to continue. And I think that's certainly true. But now I've become more and more to think that it's also true the other way around, so that there's a two-way road, in the sense that by working on longevity and by hastening and by bringing about escape velocity and longevity, we can actually solve many of the other existential risks that we are worried about. And with solving, I don't mean we will have solved them in a moment, but we are creating a strong multiplier effect for us to work on them. Why do I think that? Well, I think that we would like to think of ourselves altruistically enough to think about the very long future, but ultimately we are not always at our best, right? And I think that there was Haldane who worked on the mathematics of kin selection, who said something like he joked that he would be willing to lay down his life for 2 brothers or 8 cousins, right? And I think that is like that is one way to look at it, but I think it also holds true intergenerationally, right? If you think about, you're probably willing to sacrifice a lot for your kids, you're probably willing to sacrifice a lot for your grandkids, but then the further you go down the line, how much are you actually willing to sacrifice for the next generations, for those after and for those after that? And so I think the further you go, the more impersonal it becomes. And so I think that by bringing about escape velocity and longevity, and actually feeling that we can continue to exist, you're creating an incredible skin in the game that is an effect that is really not to be underestimated. Because I think that even if we like to say that we care in altruistic terms, this is an effect that picks even those folks up who would not care otherwise about a long-term future for civilization. And so I think rather than just framing our quest in terms of quality-adjusted life years saved by just focusing on aging, which is already a really great thing in itself, even if you just care about people alive today, I think even if you care about future generations, actually making sure that people have skin in the game is a really great aspect. And I'm not saying we're perfect at it. I still discount my future self somewhat, right? We all do that to some extent. And maybe that's rational, right? Because we have more local knowledge about what benefits us now. But I'm just saying that if you care about the long-term future, making it really easy for others to care too could have major implications, I think, for the way that even Prisoner's Dilemma currently are solved right now.
You can find the full conversation, as well as other videos from our conference, on our website and YouTube channel. This month, Science to Save the World continued to explore the science behind cellular reprogramming. More episodes of Lifespan News have also been released, including on topics such as a new cryptocurrency which seeks to fund science and technology, whether or not there is a natural limit to human lifespan, William Shatner in space, and more. In the most recent episode, I responded to a Sam Harris podcast discussing what he called the paradox of death, and we get into some philosophy about death and consciousness. We'll play that for you now. I want you to imagine for a moment what death is like. If you're like many people, you may be picturing nothingness, a void, an abyss, or an eternal sleep. But does this make sense? Is consciousness immune to death? We'll explore this topic and respond to a recent podcast from Sam Harris on this episode of Lifespan News. Sam Harris, the well-known author and neuroscientist, recently released an episode of his Making Sense podcast titled The Paradox of Death. In it, he re-articulated and seemed to endorse the idea of generic subjective continuity, described by philosopher Thomas Clark in an essay called Death, Nothingness, and Subjectivity, which is written from the view of a naturalist and materialist. According to Clark, this essay is intended to critique a widespread misunderstanding of death as a plunge into oblivion, and I think it does that quite well. But then it concludes with something that Clark admits feels mystical, and I think this is where the argument goes off the rails, and warrants a response from a life extension perspective. I'm a frequent listener of Sam Harris's podcast, and even though I do have my disagreements with him, I find that he's typically worth a listen. But I can't get on board with this take, and I'll tell you why. But first, let's start with where I think there's agreement. At the beginning of this, I asked you to imagine what death is like. In a recent video, I discussed how William Shatner saw the blackness of space on a Blue Origin rocket launch and described the experience to Jeff Bezos as seeing death. So you may have pictured something like that. But in reality, my request to you doesn't even make sense. Absent some discovery that changes what we know about death, dead isn't a state that you can be in, because dead is the absence of you. It is not like anything to be dead. It's not something you'll ever experience, regardless of whether or not you die. You can experience dying, you can't experience death. So it doesn't even make sense to try to imagine it. I expect that many of you agree with this so far, and if you don't, please let me know why in the comments below. But now, let's move on to where Clark and Harris lost me, with an argument that is said to be derived from naturalism and materialism, but does come across as mystical and supernatural, and at least to me, not as helpful or uplifting as they intend it to be. And it starts off in a very uncontroversial manner. We've all slept. Some of us have been knocked out or under general anesthesia. So we've all undergone periods of altered consciousness or unconsciousness. And from the points of view of the individual, consciousness was consistent. You didn't experience unconsciousness because that doesn't make sense. You simply went from a state of consciousness at one time and place to a state of consciousness in another time and place. You did not experience being unconscious in the meantime. If you did experience something within that gap period, then you weren't unconscious. This, I think, is pretty easy to understand. Now, let's complicate things a bit. During this period of unconsciousness, your body aged. Changes, however imperceptible, occurred. In the events of general anesthesia, perhaps you had a part of your body removed, or replaced with an artificial version, a version from a cadaver, or from a still living human. In this case, fairly significant things about you have changed. But when you snap back into consciousness, you are still you. The self, or identity, that existed before unconsciousness is preserved after unconsciousness. This is what Clark refers to as personal subjective continuity. But how far can we extend this? Let's say you sign up for cryonics and are vitrified. Thousands of years later, on an entirely different planet, you are reanimated. But you didn't experience those thousands of years. From your perspective, it would likely feel the same as falling asleep last night and waking up this morning. That personal subjective continuity was preserved across time and distance. But now let's say that there were some drastic changes that occurred during those thousands of years. Maybe you experienced some deterioration, and memories faded or personality traits were lost. Perhaps you underwent genetic modifications. Maybe well-meaning future scientists removed all the traumas and sadness from your memories and replaced them with happy fictions that never happened. Maybe they removed old body parts and replaced them with new ones. How far can we push these changes until whatever snaps into consciousness is no longer you, but someone or something else? Now, we can get into debates about the mind-body problem and whether or not we are individuals, or if the self is an illusion, or if we even have any basis to the claim that we still are the person we were yesterday. And perhaps to be thorough, we should get into those things. But for the sake of time, we have to largely set them aside. And now we've reached where I begin to disagree with Clark and Harris. It seems that they would argue that there is a point where enough changes have occurred That conscious being, post-vitrification, is no longer the identity, the self that it was before. That consciousness was lost, and in essence, that person has died, and that a new consciousness has taken its place. We lost personal subjective continuity, but now we have generic subjective continuity. And Clark argues that this is essentially no different than going to sleep and having a new person wake up in your place. Just as when you fall asleep, there's no experience of unconsciousness. The difference here is that, with this awakened consciousness, we've lost that personal subjective continuity. From this point of view, consciousness didn't stop, it just transformed. We have a transformation of the subject. Perhaps there was a continuity of the body, a remaining link between the subject that was and the subject that is. But that body doesn't even have to remain consistent. We mentioned during my cryonics example that perhaps scientists replace a vitrified person's body parts with new body parts. Let's imagine that happened in this scenario. Now the memories are different, the perceived identity is different, and even the body is different. What went to sleep last night is unrecognizable when compared with what woke up in its place, but there was still no experience of unconsciousness. Awareness was just as continuous for these two subjects as it is for you when you go to sleep and then wake up. At least, this is what Clark argues. And now we really get into the seemingly mystical. Clark ends by arguing that this transformation, in which one context of awareness dies and another arises, is no different than if you were to die and a new human were to be born. One death and one birth is akin to the transformation from one subject to another that, in our example, occurred during sleep. What's more, that gap between death and birth could be millions of years and galaxies apart. Clark says that subjectivity would jump that gap just as easily as it jumps the gap from our last experience before sleep to the first upon awakening. Clark admits that we've moved from the fairly uncontroversial fact of the continuity of one person's experience to what he calls a seemingly outlandish, but I would call a fully outlandish, notion that consciousness is impervious to death or any sort of objective interruption. Now, let me explain where and why I disagree with this. Clark, and by extension Harris, seem to argue that the loss of personal subjective continuity that would occur during the transformation process constitutes the death of one person and the birth of another. I don't think so. I think that a single being, a single instantiation of consciousness, survived the transformation process. The memories and identity and physical form may be different, but the consciousness is the same. No consciousness died and no new one was formed. Here's an example of what I mean. Railroad worker Phineas Gage had an iron rod destroy much of his frontal lobe in the 1840s. He survived, but his personality and behaviors had reportedly changed, so much so that his friends saw him as no longer Gage. Now, there are questions about the extent of this personality change and for how long it lasted, but regardless of the facts of this actual case, we can imagine a person suffering brain damage to the point that they are indeed changed, that their memories are gone, that they are no longer recognizable as the person they once were, either to themselves or to others. This doesn't mean that they died and that a new consciousness arose. They didn't. Regardless of what they remember or what their personality is, a single instantiation of consciousness existed before and exists now. No death occurred. Brain tumors, amnesia, hypnosis, and mental illness. I imagine all of these could theoretically result in a change in memory, identity, or personality that Clark and Harris might be enticed to refer to as a loss of personal subjective continuity, especially if there's an intervening period of sleep or unconsciousness that separate one state from another, but they don't constitute a death or a birth. My personal take at this point is that you are a single instantiation of consciousness, and it can die. And once that death occurs, it does not jump a gap of time and distance to a new being. I want to preserve my personal subjective continuity, but if I wake up tomorrow fully believing that I'm someone else, and with none of my old memories, there was still no death. That's still what I would call me, a single consciousness, even if what my friends and family knew as me was gone and never to return. Just to clarify here, if during this period of sleep or suspension my brain were removed and replaced, or perhaps replaced by a new substrate for consciousness, such as an advanced computer, then I'd argue that it may be the case that there is actually a new consciousness present there, but it would not be a continuation of the old. Perhaps my removed brain could continue on, maintaining personal subjective continuity elsewhere, but that's not in my body. We lost that continuity. Clarke ends by saying, to identify ourselves with generic subjectivity is perhaps as far as the naturalistic materialist can go towards accepting some sort of immortality. It isn't conventional immortality, not even as good as living in others' memory, some might think, since there is no one who survives, just the persistence of subjectivity for itself. It is possible that this view may make it easier to cope with the prospect of personal extinction, since if we accept it, we can no longer anticipate being hurled into oblivion to face the eternal blackness. We may wear our personalities more lightly, seeing ourselves as simply variations on a theme of subjectivity which is in no danger of being extinguished by our passing. Of course, we cannot completely put aside our biologically given aversion to the prospect of death, but we can ask, at its approach, why we are so attached to this context of consciousness. Why, if experience continues anyway, is it so terribly important that it continue within this set of personal characteristics, memories, and body? If we are no longer haunted by nothingness, then dying may seem more like the radical refreshment of subjectivity than its extinction. This, I take it, is meant to be comforting, but it's not. Believing that some consciousness will spring into being at some point in the future, and being told that that's no different than me falling asleep and waking up as someone else, doesn't do a lot for me. First of all, I do think it's different, but even if it weren't, it's only reassuring in the sense that it's reassuring to think about the fact that the atoms in our bodies could be recycled time and time again, living on in some sense, even in the event of our death. But a loss of personal subjective continuity is what I seek to avoid. It's what I believe we should all seek to put an end to. Even if that loss of personal continuity isn't equivalent to death, as I argue it isn't, it is what makes each of us who we are and who we identify as. And though we will all change over time, your skills, interests, knowledge, and likely appearance will be very different at age 60 than at age 20, for example. Even if we're able to halt the physical aging process, there's a continuity of consciousness, of a single experience, that we should seek to preserve. So I'd argue that what proponents of life extension actually want to extend isn't just life or health, but a single personal subjective continuity that preserves, at a minimum, memory and identity. It's a lofty goal, but it's one I think we should strive for, and I don't think that we should settle for less than that. You can find more episodes of Lifespan News on YouTube at youtube.com/Lifespan News. Please subscribe and help us spread the word. That's it for this episode of the Rejuvenation Roundup podcast. Thank you very much for spending another month with us, and for your help in the fight against age-related diseases. Don't forget, you can get additional deep dives into science, technology, and futurism on the Future Grind podcast. Find out more at futuregrind.org. Once again, I'm your host, Ryan O'Shea, and on behalf of the team at Leaf, we wanted to thank you for joining us. We hope to see you next time on the Rejuvenation Roundup podcast.